We're now on? Okay. Okay, so while Oddgeir was talking, I was pulling files out to respond to things he was saying. So while I fiddle around with various things here, let me show you a 3-minute video clip that ties in very much with what he was saying. Okay, so enter full screen, and we're not showing it, are we? That's kind of worrying. We're not seeing what we've got. Let's see what's going on here. Okay, let's see, displays, arrangement. There we go.
Yeah, that's what you
Got it. Okay.
I was really excited to experiment with teaching a class online. The opportunity presented itself, and I said, well, why not?
There is enormous excitement amongst the faculty. There has been more discussion of teaching, the right ways to teach, methods that work because of this whole online education.
Students are now seeing many courses that are taught in this style, and so I think we're starting to refine what we do.
I really thought that going to classes
Probably. It's this one here that's the killer.
going
Do we will find
Oh, okay. Right. If I can. Okay. If I get to that, I'll do that. That's probably better. Okay. Let's take that again from the top, as they say in the business.
I was really excited to experiment with teaching a class online. The opportunity presented itself, and I said, well, why not?
There is enormous excitement amongst the faculty. There has been more discussion of teaching, the right ways to teach, methods that work because of this whole online education.
Students are now seeing many courses that are taught in this style, and so I think we're starting to refine what we do.
I really thought that going to classes for more hands-on time was more valuable than just going to class for lecture. I thought it was really good to be able to watch the lectures online at my own pace and be able to pause when I needed to and take notes.
We're really interested in 4 different uses of the technology. One is our students on campus. Second, we can allow our students or people who sign up for our programs to take our classes and participate and learn from each other when they're not on campus. Third, I think there's a great opportunity now to take material that we produce on campus and that we use for our own students and share that with other colleges and universities. And finally, as we've seen in the MOOCs, it's possible to reach a really big audience worldwide with some of our material.
One of the biggest questions is also apparently the most straightforward. What is a university? Is it a collection of students and faculty meeting in classrooms? Is it a research production machine? Is it a beautiful campus and a football team? What pieces of the university can be disaggregated from the others? And how do you build educational experiences that are characteristically Stanford, but are conveyed and experienced in a very different way?
There's everything about the Stanford ecosystem that makes this the right place to explore this new mode of education. The expertise that exists in the computer science department, who are responsible for creating many of the platforms that are being used in different parts of the world. The expertise in the School of Education, where we can have help evaluating the effectiveness of the system of delivering education in this fashion. It includes the expertise in the other professional schools, the Graduate School of Business and the Law School.
When you're teaching a class that's going to be online, viewed by tens of thousands of people, in my case including my mum, then you're going to put in the extra effort in order to make the quality and the presentation that much better.
It's the beginning of a wholesale reorganization of teaching and learning in higher education. It will very soon be an unignorable phenomenon. This is not a sort of fringe activity of Cambridge and Silicon Valley. This is something that is going to be reorganizing the entire sector.
One observation about that. There's a lot of press attention towards the MOOCs and the online courses. And in fact, just 2 days ago, the 4th startup company coming out of Stanford to provide a MOOC platform came out. So we now have 4 startup companies, each with $16 million to $24 million of VC funding coming out. And that gets the attention because it's all about technologies and streaming videos and things. But I'll point out that in that list of priorities, when John Mitchell, the Vice President for Online Learning, was talking about what's going on, the MOOCs was an additional number 4. That's a side issue. It's an important side issue with all kinds of implications for the world, but that's not what's going on. Those questions were about human society. What is a university? How do we organize ourselves? When do people come together? What do they come together? The technology is just something out there that's raising the question and allowing us to experiment. So what the rest of the world sees and what's actually going on are 2 very different things. So let me, with that out of the way, go into a quick background onto why this kind of thing's coming out of Silicon Valley. And in many ways, the name is a misnomer because Silicon Valley suggests that it's all about technology, the hardware. Well, first of all, it's not built there anymore anyway. It's all built in China. But in any case, it never really was about technology. That was just part of what was driving things. It was all about people. And in particular, it's all about people in a particular part of the world. Okay, so for those of you who haven't been to Stanford, that's the view you get. Well, if you want a small helicopter, that's the view. But that's coming up Palm Drive into the main part of campus. This is the old original part of campus, 19th century part of campus. It's a fairly new university, 1891. But there were some contradictions about this. First of all, in American terms, in US terms, this is huge in that it's got all of these different schools, these different faculties is the European term. And that's extremely unusual. And we're often compared with MIT. Well, MIT is essentially an engineering school with a humanities and sciences department behind it. It doesn't have all of these. This is a full ecosystem of university expertise. So in some ways it's big. It's got a huge spread. But it's tiny. We are a small university, fewer than 2,000 faculty. We are a tiny little undergraduate school, less than 7,000 undergraduates. We are an enormous graduate school, almost pushing 9,000 graduate students from 100 countries. We are international, but in terms of graduate education, we are huge. In terms of the budget, we are pretty darn big. 1.2 billion was the last complete year for sponsored research. We are a private university, but you have to be careful when you use that term. I've got dual nationality now, so I can say we Americans. We like to pretend we are the land of the free, and it's all about private enterprise. No, it's not. It's just that we channel the government funding through different ways to make it look as though we're not a socialist country. Well, we're not a socialist country, but we do have. Only governments can perform basic research, and 4/5 of Stanford's budget for the most private of the privates. You know, the stellar place for for-profit enterprises. 4/5 of the money comes from there. Those images we saw of Tim Berners-Lee and Doug Engelbart and so forth, they were all funded by Defense Department money. And that's really, here's Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, operated by Stanford for the Department of Energy. We're a government organization. On the other hand, we do have a pretty stellar record of spin-off companies coming out. You know, and already I need to update this because I did go back a week or two ago and add Coursera and Udacity, but there are 2 more spin-offs that are out providing online platforms. But we've got a very stellar record of spin-off activity. You may call it the envy of the world if you want to. It only makes sense to call it an envy if you actually want to do that. But there's a whole ton of spin-off companies come out of Stanford. So we are doing something. Something's happening there that is very unusual. These are just some of the more famous ones. They don't all still exist, but these all achieved in their time some substantial size in terms of market cap or sales or whatever. Okay, and I'm just going to show you briefly some images that were produced by Martha, and she may talk about this in more depth in her talk. But these just illustrate the degree of activity going on in Silicon Valley. It is an extremely unusual place. And this is research Martha did into alumni networks for Harvard, Berkeley, MIT, and Stanford, comparing spin-off activity. You've got a university, the blue dots are the alumni, the red dots are companies started by those alumni. The size of the dots refers to the size of these activities. So here you've got MIT, you've got an MIT alum who started a lot of companies. And Martha later on can talk in the questions as to the various criteria for being on this chart. But as you can see, MIT is pretty active in terms of spin-off activity. If you compare it with Berkeley, you get a much bigger university. And so you've got a lot more activity, but it's roughly the same kind of graph. So you've got the same kind of spin-off activity coming out of Berkeley. Compare it with Harvard, and most people initially, when Martha first showed me this thing, when she did this research a couple of years ago, this one surprised me. I thought, Harvard? What have they got to do with spin-off companies? And then, of course, you realize there's a thing called Harvard Business School. And if you've got a startup company, you need a CEO from somewhere. And Harvard tends to provide them. So I'm pretty sure that reflects not Harvard engineering, although there is some good engineering, but really Harvard MBAs. Okay, and then the question might be, okay, you've got all of this activity, they're pretty impressive. How does Stanford stack up? And the answer is, it stacks up in its whole domain. It's different. This is a different degree. This is an order of magnitude difference in terms of startup activity. Huge amount of startup activity coming out of there. And the question is why? You know, what have we got that MIT doesn't have, for example, or that Berkeley doesn't have? In both cases, sunshine is one of the answers, because being on the East Bay, you don't get sunshine. It's kind of strange. But if you come to the Bay Area, you'll find that the weather changes every 10 kilometers. It's a very interesting ecosystem. So just across the bay in Berkeley, it's usually foggy and misty and kind of cold, as it is in San Francisco. And down in Palo Alto, the sun's out and the temperature's in the upper 20s. That was last week, the temperature was in the upper 20s. I was out on my bicycle in the sunshine and thinking I wish I'd put some sunblock on. All right, so we've got a degree of activity here that's quite different. Okay, how did that come about? You can't really understand this place unless you understand its history. And you certainly should understand the history if you want to take any of the ideas from them, because a lot of what's going on is not reproducible. And it's really a result of 1.5 accidents and a huge amount of central planning. And if we want to see the start, you've got to go back to the late 19th century with the founding of MIT. You know, historically, universities came out of the monasteries. They were monastic. They were ivory towers. The idea was you reclused yourself from the world and you thought deep thoughts. That's what universities are like. And most of that culture is in the university systems in Europe and in the United States. You literally take yourself away and you insulate yourself from funding and industries and businesses. That's the standard model, and the laws and the system in the United States supports that. There are incredible laws that stop you mixing private money and public money. And, you know, presidents who don't follow those rules have to resign or get fired. So there's a lot of rules about universities. And pretty well all universities, except a few, follow the rules. However, in the late 19th century, when the Massachusetts economy was just going downhill, it was an old milling and area, and that economy was dying. In Massachusetts, together, the government and private industry created a new kind of university which was established to bring together industry people and universities, and they created a charter and a structure that in principle allowed that to happen. It's now known as the Entrepreneurial University. And the idea was the university would work very closely with people. And it was a new university. It wasn't a case of going to the university and saying, from next year, you will work with industry, because that never works. Right? You have to create a new one and bring people in who want to do it. Well, it was one thing to set it up. It was another thing to make it happen. It actually didn't happen. And it didn't happen for all of the usual reasons. That the academics just didn't see any reason to do it. But then the Second World War comes along. And the US, when it gets into the Second World War, rather late, after Pearl Harbor was bombed, realizes it has to very quickly create the infrastructure to fight a large modern war, its first one. And so they poured a huge amount of money into the East Coast establishment, the universities around Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, the big established universities. University of Pennsylvania got a lot of it. MIT was a small place, but it got increasingly large amounts of it. And because MIT had this structure that allowed it to do work with industry, in the end, increasingly, the money went into MIT. And it turned MIT from a rather small place. Within 4 or 5 years, it was a powerhouse. It was an international powerhouse in technology, developing radar countermeasures, and so forth. So it was just the force of having to fight a war with a big budget in a large economy like the United States. And one of the new things they did, which had never been done before, was the government just gave huge amounts of money to the scientists at MIT and let them decide how to allocate it. Out of that, you got the beginnings of the National Science Foundation, and then eventually NASA and all of the various organizations, all coming out of this necessity of giving the money to the scientists and letting the scientists allocate it. That was a new way of doing things, taking public funds and letting the scientists themselves allocate it. And then after the Second World War, when the US built up DARPA and the National Science Foundations, that was, particularly with DARPA, that idea of letting scientists or representatives of scientists allocate huge amounts of money was huge. Okay, so Stanford is still a small university on the West Coast. There'd been some, Hewlett and Packard and people had come out of it, but it wasn't that great a university. It was a small university, wealthy with a lot of land, but it wasn't a big deal. And it wasn't a big deal at the end of the Second World War. However, one of the people that went from Stanford to MIT to do the work on radar was Frederick Terman, a young professor of electrical engineering, who went out and then after the war comes back to Stanford, having seen how everything works at MIT, and with a mission to transform Stanford into a brand new, modern, technology-oriented global university. And he knew something that a lot of people would soon find out, was that with the changing global system, with the emergence of the Cold War, there was about to be billions of dollars going to whichever university was able to best take them. And so from the early 1950s onwards, massive amounts of money started flowing into the West Coast. Now you may ask, why the West Coast? You've got all of these great universities on the East Coast that done well in the Second World War. Why suddenly pick this university on the West Coast and start pouring most of the money out west? Well, the answer, as much as anything, was space. To fight the Cold War, you needed a lot of new technologies, and you needed to grow them very fast. So you needed somewhere to build them. You needed a place where you've got a lot of land that could quickly be converted into new kinds of factories, clean factories that weren't sort of smoke and oil-driven, but were doing technology development. You needed a place where there was at least some good universities to providing people and that would provide infrastructures for spending money. You needed a place where people could move in quickly, where you could build lots of houses, where there was at least 1, 2, maybe even 3 airports. You needed to create very fast an entire ecosystem to develop technologies. You couldn't do that on the East Coast. It was built out. You couldn't do it. There were, by the way, they did try raising lots of land in Philadelphia. They tried knocking down all kinds of slums and moving people out to the suburbs and recreating stuff. But it got involved in the laws. I mean, there were people making, it just was too slow. But out at Stanford, you've got an area of land from San Francisco in the north, about 100 kilometers or so, all the way down to San Jose at the bottom. And it's just flat orchards. In the middle, you've got Stanford University, but it's just orchards, mile after mile of orchards, apricots, peaches, oranges and things. It was known popularly as the Valley of Heart's Delight. Must have been delightful. Acres of orange groves and peaches and things, mile after mile of them, on this flat piece of land, all the way down with this bucolic little university in Palo Alto in the middle. But boy, it wouldn't take long to pull out the orchards, put in roads, freeways, mile after mile of tract housing, and lots of low properties where you could create an infrastructure. And you've got San Francisco International Airport, you've got San Jose Airport, and you've got Oakland Airport in the east. And you've got a place that people will like to live with a nice climate. So it won't be difficult attracting people there. And at least for a time, housing will be cheap. It wasn't by the time I got there in the 80s, but it had been. Okay, so you've got this huge amount of time, but this is out Soviet Union, the out Soviet Union. This is building a complete ecosystem from scratch. And the beauty of it is, there is a great university in the middle, which has a lot of land, with a lot of money, but it's not a strong university. So when a dean goes back and tries to change it, and gets the support of his president, there is not a strong faculty to object. You couldn't have done this anywhere on the East Coast, because the faculty wouldn't have allowed it. But there wasn't a faculty to stop it. So this just happened very, very fast. When Terman decides they'll open a shopping mall, a super upscale shopping mall, to bring in money, discretionary money for the university, they just go ahead and do it. I mean, who'd ever heard of that before? A university creating a shopping mall. They did. Brought in a lot of revenue for a while. Lots of new stuff was going on. They had a big business park. They created Stanford Business Park. Hewlett and Packard, varying associates with various people that moved into there. So you've got a lot of activity, and it's all fueled by the Cold War. This is the threat of annihilation is driving this. And you've got a country with a budget that can match and outmatch the adversary, and does it very fast. And then there's a half an accident happens. You've got a guy over at Bell Labs in New Jersey, William Shockley, invents a transistor, starts to develop what will become microchips, has all kinds of problems because it turned out, like many inventors, he wasn't a good manager. And he eventually decides to move out. And after a couple of years, moves into Mountain View, just south of Palo Alto, to form Shockley Semiconductor. Now, I say it's a half an accident. It's only a half because I don't know. I'm not even sure if it is known. But he was probably brought to the Bay Area as much as anything. Well, he had some relatives in the area. But he also, I think it was a sister or something like that. But in any case, it was probably the funding. There was a lot of money going out there. There was an infrastructure being built. So if you want to capitalize, it was probably part of the reasoning that there was going to be funds coming in and there was going to be people you could hire. So I'm saying that's a half an accident, because he could have stayed on the East Coast, but he didn't. So all of a sudden, the key technology for information technology finds its key proponent right in the middle of Silicon Valley. Stanford didn't have anything to do with this, as far as I know. As I say, it may have been the funding was part of the influence. But the guy still hadn't learned how to manage, and it wasn't long before the 8 smartest people, or 8 of the smartest people in the company, just broke away to form their own company. And it wasn't that long after that that 2 of those guys, Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce, left to form Intel. And suddenly you've got modern information technology right there in the middle of Silicon Valley, with a huge amount of funding supporting it. And not long afterwards, a journalist writes an article for, I think it was Electronic News or something like that, in which this area was called Silicon Valley, because they were actually making some of these things there. At about the same time, you've got the first venture capital company moving into the area. On Sand Hill Road, the road that connects Palo Alto down to Interstate 280 into the city, you've got the first of what was going to be many VC companies moving in, sensing private. I mean, up until now, it's basically been government-driven. You've got some funding. I mean, VCs actually funded Hewlett-Packard when it was founded, and you've got a lot of private enterprise, but they were mostly coming in. The private enterprise was mostly coming in because of government contracts, which even goes back to the days of the Navy back in the 30s and 40s. The Bay Area has always had a history of technology. Lockheed Martin had been there a long time, but it was initially defense contractors, and then other groups were moving in. But with the VCs moving in, you've got another funding mechanism coming in. This is not so much, this is sort of private capital, and it's getting in towards consumer electronics. But then there was an accident. Then there was the full-blown accident. Something happened that had nothing to do with government money and had nothing to do with Stanford. It had everything to do with Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, who just happened to grow up in Cupertino down the road and form a company called Apple that's making consumer products. I mean, one of the part of the genius of Steve Jobs was realizing that the computer could be taken from something that was for the geeks and turned into a consumer product. Now, his genius was recognizing the market and how you could create a market with a huge market demand out of something that didn't exist before. That turns out to be a really smart move. Nothing to do with Stanford, just that he was local. And when that went public in 1980, at $1.3 billion, making more millionaires overnight than the world had ever known before, suddenly everybody sees that there's money to be made, and you get lots of VCs pouring in. So this is recent. This is really recent. You get lots of law firms coming in, and you get lots of startups happening. So the Silicon Valley we know, which is driven in large part by private capital, that's a recent phenomenon, and it's built on the tail, or the back, or whatever, of all of this government funding. It has been observed that we are still reaping the benefits of the massive amounts of government funding that funded things like the mouse, the Windows interface, the Macintosh interface, the Ethernet. All of that technology infrastructure was funded from government money, with millions being poured into Doug Engelbart at SRI to build that interface. And we're still living on the tail of that. The Internet, the World Wide Web, is still coming on top of the DARPANET. How much we can milk that amount of funding is not clear. And if we don't reinvigorate the basic funding, that is going to die. I don't think Silicon Valley will die, because Silicon Valley is actually not about technology. Silicon Valley specializes in innovation. That's the product in Silicon Valley. If you live there, you know it. Doesn't matter what it is. It'll move on. There's already a lot of work in green tech, and there's a lot of work now, as you can see from that little video at the beginning, into reimagining what the university is. What is education in general? What is higher education? If you've got a population who's learned how to learn, which is what the K-12 system does, what do? How do you provide education? And I'll circle back to my own experience with the MOOC and the online education at the end. Okay, so this is the Cold War, essentially. It's a Second World War followed by the Cold War, and the fact that there were two universities that have been structured to allow this to happen. I've been a department chair, I've been a dean, I've turned away from becoming a college president because it looks like a terrible job. And if there's one thing I learned, it's that you can't make a tenured professor do anything that he or she doesn't want to do. So it doesn't matter whether you want to be innovative or not. The only way to be innovative is to create a university and only hire people who want to be at an innovative university. And Stanford and MIT were created to do that. And even so, it took a Second World War in one case and the Cold War in the other to make it happen. So you've got two places in the world where this happens and people gravitate to. And it's interesting to note the difference, by the way, in the way MIT did it during the Second World War, which was essentially top-down government funding, and the way Stanford happened when Stanford grew up in the Cold War era with faculty-led. Very different structures, and we can see that in what's happened with these online platforms, with the MOOCs. Okay, I'll come back to this story in a minute, but when you look at what happened in the MOOCs, when Stanford developed this platform, and it was all internal research to looking at. It wasn't to do. Sebastian Thrun launched Udacity for various reasons, and we'll maybe come back to that. But the project itself was about learning research and flipped classrooms and educational efficiencies and so forth. It wasn't meant to be a new technology, a new industry, any more than the World Wide Web was meant to be anything more than physicists sharing papers over the internet. Okay, so you've got this platform being developed. As soon as it became clear that there was, at least for a short time, a demand for MOOCs, you've got, in typical Stanford fashion, 4 startup companies to date coming out, and Stanford still has its own platform at home. MIT does something different. They, together with Harvard, create edX, which is, literally it's a university enterprise. It's going to be open source. And just a couple of weeks ago, Stanford basically said, we've done our research. There are 4 startup companies. They're on their own now, funded by private capital. The internal platform, which is called Class2Go, the further development of that is now being outsourced to MIT to develop this platform. So Stanford has basically thrown away everything to do with these MOOC platforms. It's either private enterprise or it's up to MIT and Harvard. That's not where our interest is. That's gone. That's moved off. It's typical Stanford. If there's an idea comes, startup companies or somebody else takes it over. The focus is on the innovation and the original questions. You could see in those people being interviewed what the interesting questions are. What is a university? How do people work together? It's all fundamental social questions and psychological questions about people interacting together. That's the kind of focus you get there, and it always has been there. So it's a very different way of going about things. Incidentally, Stanford really doesn't make money out of its IP any more than MIT does. There are 3 IP licenses at Stanford that generate more than $1 million a year. There's about 30 licenses that generate more than $100,000 a year, and the rest don't generate much at all. And MIT has similar figures. There are many myths, one of which is that universities make a lot of money. I mean, I think Stanford does make about $60 million a year out of IP licenses, but that's kind of not a lot of money for a big university with a $1.5 billion research project. So the technology goes around and it spins out. Okay, so there's the history. Virtually unrepeatable. And it's resulted in an ecosystem that's unique in the world. And just think what you've got. And you need to realize the scale. We are talking about a small group of people, a few thousand people. There may be a half a dozen coffee shops in the Palo Alto region, and if you go in those coffee shops on a regular basis, you will probably meet most of the key VCs and CEOs around. I mean, you just will. It's a small group of people. You may be amazed at the number of successful startups that created because the 2 founders had kids going to the same schools, and they met at the PTAs and so forth. Very common. It's lots of chance meetings between people. It's serendipity all the way through. Very little planning. The one thing that Stanford people have become really good at, and I know that because it happened to me when I went to Stanford in '87 from England, and after several years, I found that just by osmosis, I'd developed this ability that people at Stanford have, which is you're really not interested in founding companies. You're not interested in making money. You're there because you're really interested in doing research. But you have a radar that you're not aware of spinning all the time. And the moment you come up with something that might be commercializable or might turn into a product, a little bell goes off and says, ping, let's talk to somebody about whether there's an idea here. You know, it happened to me, it happens to everybody. You just get used to doing that. Not because anyone tells you, it's just because everybody else does. And if you do get that idea, you can exercise on it, you can act really easily with no training. And I'll take you through this, and then I'll give you a little bit of a personal story, because I'm probably about to become the oldest startup entrepreneur at Stanford. So you've got a very active human network. And I put that top because that's key. It's all about meeting people and talking to them all the time. You know, I think it's not entirely surprising, well, in some ways it is, but it's not entirely surprising when you reflect on it, that when Marissa Mayer, who was a Stanford grad from a few years ago, when she goes to take over Yahoo and realizes that that whale is almost totally dead and is going to take some reviving, she immediately says, we need to recreate the human network, you know, and insists that everybody comes back to work there. Very active human network. Everybody you need is local. You can talk to them. It used to be that if you wanted to get on in business, you joined the local golf club. Well, now you go and spend $8,000 on an all-carbon fibre road bike, and you go biking because all the people you want to talk to are either on the saddle of a road bike or the saddle of a mountain bike. And if you can do both, you can start a company. Okay. I actually created our first H-star partnership with the Finnish university system through TechES, and all of the negotiations right up to signing the contract with the Finnish government were made on the back of bicycles, as we every week, together with Sakari Karpinen, who was the TechES agent in San Jose. He and I were both keen cyclists. Every week, I think Wednesday or Thursday, we'd meet in San Jose and we'd bike up Mount Hamilton, which is a 22-mile climb up to the top, about 4,000 feet. It takes about just under 2 hours to get there and an hour to come down. And you can do a lot of talking in 2 hours going up a hill, with no phones, no distractions, and it's very primeval. And you can really thresh out a good business plan. Okay, but it's all done by people face to face or sitting next to each other on bicycle saddles. You've got a lot of big companies. You've got some big companies. If you want entrepreneurship and innovation, it has to be almost risk-free for the innovator. If you start up a company, the chances are very high it's going to fail, which means the day after it fails, you need a job. You've got kids, you've got a mortgage and things. There's plenty of big companies desperate for talent who will hire you. In fact, the company you probably left to start the company you did will take you back. Little side issue. Innovation is not about big companies innovating. I mean, they do that. They have marketing departments that say they innovate. And sometimes they do, but mostly they don't. Most Silicon Valley innovation is by 3 or 4 people in a big company taking an idea and starting their own company. It's mostly driven by startup companies. Now, they may get bought back by the big company, they may get bought out by somebody else, but mostly the innovation is break away. And the reason people do that is it's risk-free. First of all, even though there are some laws that say you can't really break away from a company and take their ideas and set up in competition, it's accepted practice in California that no one enforces the laws. You're actually encouraged and supported to leave a company, take the ideas, and start up in competition. Part of the reason I was able to start up a company was I'd worked as a consultant with a big company, and in my contract it said, I will not bring out a product essentially similar to the ones in development at the company until 12 months after I've left. So what did I do? I get an idea, and the company was not going to pursue it. And I think, it's going to take me at least 12 years to turn this into a new idea anyway. And by that time, I'm free as a bird. And so I did. Took away some of their engineers, and away we went. But the big companies is important. They're fertile grounds for incubating ideas within them. And then if the company fails, you can go back. So that provides enormous stability over the long haul. you've got this powerful, now very powerful university with friends in high places in Washington with a culture of involvement. In the Bay Area, it's cool for academics to work with industry, particularly at Stanford. It's not just something that some people do, it's actually coin of the realm. The students think you're much cooler if you're working with industry. Okay. And that's this idea of entrepreneurial science, which essentially comes out of MIT. Very few of the people at Stanford that do this ever leave. I mean, Jim Clark was an exception, some others, but mostly people like John Hennessy, now the president, start up a company, get the company going, and go back to the university. Very common for people to want to do it, because they're really not interested in running the company. They're interested in the ideas. You've got a very large state university, because if you are at Stanford and you start a company, very quickly you probably need to hire a half a dozen key people. Well, you may not find them at Stanford, but they're across the bay. So locally, which means you can hire them quickly, you can have personal references for people who know them, and you don't have to worry about moving them into the area, about their kids having to move, spouses saying that they don't want to move. It's all local. You just change the direction you drive to work each day. So you've got these universities on site. Just down the road, you've got there's several universities, but there's a famous one, San Jose State, doesn't have a PhD program, but it produces a lot of master's students. So if you have a company, you can quickly hire a bunch of people, produce locally. They're all there. You don't have to bring them in from outside. Huge acceptance of risk, from the funders to the entrepreneurs. Failure is absolutely something to be proud of, not to be afraid of. Very hard to find that anywhere else in the world, because different histories. Okay. It's interesting when Silicon Valley is changing into green tech, and a couple of years ago there was this big company on the East Bay down in Fremont, I think it was, called Solaris, which was a green tech company, which was funded, I think, $500 million, kind of small for green tech. And then it went belly up. It just went out of business because the Chinese were undercutting the technology. Well, that was the public reason. Who knows? Maybe it was badly managed. But whatever, it went out of business. And I don't think anybody in Silicon Valley did more than yawn. But in Washington, there was this huge fight about, oh, what a waste of money. How can we afford to make mistakes? I mean, give me a break. We can't afford not to make those kind of mistakes. The only way to get the success is to accept the mistakes. They don't know that in Washington. They don't know much of anything in Washington, actually, but they certainly don't know that. But if there's one thing you find there, it's a huge acceptance of failure. In fact, if you try to get funding for a company, probably one of the first questions the VCs will ask is, before you tell me your idea, tell me about your failure. Because what they want to know is, if I'm funding you, how will you react to failure? Because failure will come pretty soon. And how do you respond to it? Free advice, huge. I'm going to use my own example because it's current. It's a small example, but it just represents everything. I worked for about 5 years on a consultant for a stealth project with a video game studio to try and develop video games, MMOs, big, high-budget MMOs, massively multiplayer online games, in which middle school mathematics learning was embedded. So it was sort of World of Warcraft with real quests that involved doing mathematical problems. And we worked for that about 5 years on a stealth project. And when, for various reasons, the company decided to pull out, I mean, essentially budgetary reasons, it was much more expensive than their funding model could maintain, although we'd probably burned through about $30 million by then. When I and several of the key people involved in that project decided we'd pull out and start ourselves and build our own games using the ideas we'd developed, we were instantly able to get huge amounts of free advice. None of us had started a company. I mean, I'm an academic, and I was about to become the president and CEO of a company in a technology field. So what did I do? On my mountain biking rides at the weekend, I realized that there were some VCs and some angels and some lawyers and people, and on these long mountain biking rides, 3 or 4 hours on the trails, I was talking about them and getting introductions and basically getting a crash course in how to start a company, all while we were sort of biking along the trails. So after several months, I had a reasonable idea, and I knew that I could keep asking people, and there was no resistance to that. They told me huge amounts of things, offered their advice and so forth, because that's what they like doing. What they really like to do is be involved in something from the beginning. They come apart. It doesn't matter. Some of these people were successful in multi-million-dollar, even billion-dollar corporations. These were big shots. They were talking to me, this guy who just wants to make some little apps for teaching people mathematics. I mean, no way am I going to make much money at that. This is educational software. So this was small fry. They would spend hours talking with me. Why? Because for them, it was just as much fun to talk about starting that new enterprise as to starting their own enterprise before that grew big. That's what they liked to do. And they were really enthusiastic. So a lot of free advice. There's still a lot of government money for doing basic research. There's a lot of private money for exploitation. You have a fluid workforce because everyone's living locally. It's very easy to get them to change jobs. A phone call might be all that's involved. It's totally a meritocracy. No one really cares where you went to school. Anyone can play this game. And it is a game. It's absolutely a game. People play this as a game. That's why you don't care if you fail. You know, you want to win. You play to win. You absolutely want to play to win. But if you don't win, well, start again. It's all based on ability. And it's a cool place to live. It's an absolutely neat place to live. And as we all know, in the technology field, there are some weird people. And in fact, innovative people are very strange. They have all sorts of different lifestyles. You know, San Francisco Bay Area is famed for being a tolerant society. You've got everything. You don't find that anywhere else. You've almost got anywhere else you'll find some of these and some of them don't. Pittsburgh tried to create it around Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh has a lot of stuff, but boy, it was negative here. It was negative there. Pittsburgh is not friendly to gay and lesbians. Believe me, they are not. I mean, and that's already, you've lost a large number of potential employees. Austin, Texas looks a lot better if you want to do these things. But all these other places, Research Triangle Park, Silicon Glare, and all these places, they have some but not all. So you've got an ecosystem that was built in the Cold War that makes this thing happen. So that's what you've got. And the question is not how do we recreate it, but how does the rest of the world make use of it? And the answer is it's about $950 to fly from Oslo to Palo Alto, and you're right in the middle of it. And that's all you need to do. And I'm going to show another couple of charts from Martha that she can talk at length at later if she wants to. Because one of the models that a lot of people use, and the first group I was aware of doing this were the Israelis, is, you know, you go down University Avenue in Palo Alto, and above the shops, you'll find these little startup companies. And quite often you'll find 3 or 4 Israelis who are in charge of a company with about 80 people employed in Tel Aviv. And so they have the key design people, or some of them, in Palo Alto to be part of the physical network, and they have the shop behind. Very common now, especially in smaller countries. Estonia does that on big scale now. Greece is doing that. A lot of countries doing that. They have a few people in Palo Alto to have that infrastructure and use it, and their main operation is back. And in fact, this again is some research that Martha did. Interesting graph. This is where you've got the EIT labs. And this was, and, you know, Martha, as I say, could give more details later, but this is basically communications. This is how much chatter there is going between the people in these nodes. When they were doing the research, and this is just a quote from their paper, they were interested in the fact that the communication seemed to involve the Bay Area, often through the funding agencies in Sand Hill Road. And so they said, okay, there's a hidden node. In principle, it's a European network, but there's a hidden node. What happens if we make that hidden node explicit? what does this communication graph look like if you display that hidden node of the Bay Area? And the answer is the Bay Area is the dominant node. So this actually isn't a Silicon Valley phenomenon. This is a global phenomenon. And all it takes to take advantage of it is to have 3 or 4 people in the physical network, because it's a physical network, it's people. You know, connecting remotely doesn't hack it. You need to be there on the ground. And part of the reason is the people who do it are playing a game. They like the game. As I said, all of these people, you know, my development cost for my startup was delivered Chinese food or a pizza and some bottled water once a week. Because on a Friday night, we'd invite 2 or 3 people around to my little apartment in Palo Alto. We'd get some delivered food, $40 or $50, and sitting on the couch, we would have 2 or 3 Silicon Valley giants giving us advice on how to start a company. You know, how can you fail? Well, you can fail, but it really can help. And you've got to be physically there to do that. Because they're not interested in starting a company as such. It's the process they like. And it was interesting watching how they set about helping us and talking about it. They got enthusiastic about our ideas. Okay, I'm going to finish by talking about this and then just a couple of other slides, and then we'll, I'm doing well on time. Then we'll just chat. I mean, lots of questions. So if you've got questions, we'll come into them in a minute. I'll tell you a little bit about the institute that I co-founded back in about 2005. We created MediaX in 2001, and then we retrofitted an institute behind MediaX. The name was deliberate. It's in order of importance. It's about taking the human sciences, enhancing them by technologies to do advanced research. So it's the Silicon Valley approach that it's really about the people, the technology, and it has to be, because ultimately it's about consumer technologies, or at least technologies used by people, and if people don't find them useful, they're not going to be successful. And so we created this institute to make Stanford better at what Fred Terman had established back in the 50s. It basically was saying, Terman did something in the 50s, let's update it and try to make it more effective. And so we created an institute with a very broad mission, people and technology. The idea was we would focus on very broad-ranging research. Part of the reason for this mission was when we created MediaX, we got various partner companies. It was all, the research was funded by private industry. And we did a lot of research with the automobile companies. And that research involved the medical school because they were interested in detecting driver drowsiness. Well, the medical center has a sleep unit, sleep research unit. So right on the campus, you've got people who are expert in sleep. In the psychology department, you've got people who are expert in aging. And one of the other questions was, how do you deal with aging drivers? How can the car compensate for an aging driver? How can the car compensate for a driver with kids in the back? How can the car provide information? With the car turning into a mobile information system and a sensing system, research into automobiles involved the medical center, the humanities departments. Online shopping has involved the philosophy department, because online shopping, by definition, is about taking your identity and putting it out somewhere remotely on the web. And the experts in what an identity is are the philosophers. What does it mean for you to be there? All of that research has implications for business models, so the business school gets involved. All of that research has implications for the law, so the law school gets involved. So having all of these departments together means that we can do the research within Stanford that brings them all together. MediaX was created to do that with industry. H-Star did the same thing on an academic scale. So it was all about bringing together these very multidisciplinary teams that even the biggest corporation doesn't have. You know, Toyota has some great automobile engineers, but they don't have experts on sleep research or on aging. It's much cheaper for them to come to a university like Stanford. And so MediaX and H-Star were meant to capitalize on that fact, I mean, from an intellectual point of view, in order to do research. And it's very general, but it's very interdisciplinary research, and we do it by bringing together for short periods of time agile groups that come together, do some work, and then reconfigure themselves. And MediaX does it with industry, H-Star does it with universities. We're small. The total budget for research, and that includes some big federal grants, was $20 million in the last year. That's ongoing research. So it's not a it's not huge by Stanford standards, but it's sort of reasonable size. Most of the interesting research done within H-Star has a budget of maybe $50,000, $75,000 because it's early stage research. And the price tag for early stage research in the human sciences is about $75,000 a year. That's the total price of a graduate student. Because that's how it gets done, right? They're the ones that do the research. And so if you want to do some fundamental research, you get a graduate student looking at it for a year, and the bill is about $75,000. So we fund a lot of small projects. We've had various partners over the years. We've got the current one at the moment, the Danish university system. As you know, Denmark got very nervous about the fact that they weren't being innovative enough. They have a sort of perception that they're not innovative enough. I think it's a little bit false, but anyway, they have that perception. You know, they're not Silicon Valley, but hey, that's history. So they came in, the first big partner we had, in fact, the partner for whom we created H-Star, essentially, was TechES. This was the bicycle rides. You know, when Zachary and I rode these bicycles week after week, we ended up... they got a really good deal, because he's about 20 years younger than me and a much faster rider. So he had an edge in keeping me at the limit of consciousness as we were going up Mount Hamilton in the negotiations. He was also a fiendish descender, so kind of scary. But it was a lot of fun. Estonia, as I said, mentioned, they are really aggressive in the valley. In fact, Estonia today is the way TechES was back in the early 2000s. In the early 2000s, I couldn't walk from one part of the campus to another without bumping into one of the TechES agents or someone from Nokia or somewhere else. They were everywhere on the campus. Well, now it's Estonians. I mean, they're everywhere. And there's only 1.25 million of them or something. So, but they're everywhere. You just can't walk anywhere without coming across those guys. And they've really decided that they're going to milk Silicon Valley for all it's worth. And milking is the wrong word, because it's bilateral. It goes both ways. They're taking advantage of that network. Tartu has decided that they want to jump in as well. Just a couple of weeks ago, they said they're interested in joining. And we've got a number of individual faculties. We had some from Japan not long ago. We do these on an ad hoc basis. And these are to create partnerships. And so what we did with H-Star, it's a virtual network created on top of the university. And we've got all of this interdisciplinary research done by maybe 30 or 40 people. It's a small group of people, really smart people, but a small group. And it's a three-doored entity. There's a MediaX, which is the doorway to industry, with a really cool website that Martha got involved in developing. It's one of the nicest websites, because it's really looking at the partnership with industry. We have H-Star, which is deliberately a very staid-looking website, because we want our website to be read by these program managers at NSF. And we don't want them to think we're spending money on commercial stuff. So we have a nice academic website for that outfit. And then we have these research partnerships with various groups. And one of the purposes of the research partnerships is to give people the opportunity to spend some time at Stanford. And I'm sort of I've got a sort of messiah complex about that. Because in the late 80s, when I first went to Stanford, and I'd spent a lot of my career in Germany and Canada and the United States, I've traveled around a lot in my career to great universities, but nothing prepared me to go to Stanford. It absolutely didn't. It was such a different world. And after 6 months, I was no longer the same person. It absolutely transformed me. I went into Stanford as a mathematician, a card-carrying mathematician. I still have my mathematics membership card, but I don't carry it. because I just got so interested in using my knowledge, collaborating with other people. I just found that so intellectually challenging. And this idea that if you have an idea, you could start a company and still look at ideas, that I found so powerful that it just transformed me. And so when we created H-Star, it was built around the idea of giving people the opportunity to come to Stanford for 6 months, a year, to get to know people and form a network. So it's built around, a lot of it's built around bringing visitors in for short periods of time. And we bring in visitors a lot. There's a bunch of Finns just turned up this year. We've got a guy coming from Tallinn next month. We've got a bunch of Danes coming in and out, and various other people. There's nothing quite like it for transforming it. You can't read books about it. You've actually got to be there. And I experienced it myself, and it's kind of fun to let other people do it. Here's an example.
Change your age, your gender, you can change your skin color, you can be 30 feet tall, you can be a different species. You can encounter another virtual person. The brain treats it as real. However, all the rules of social engagement get thrown out the window. We're the first team that comes at this not as technologists, but really fundamentally as psychologists. And our goal, even though we do act as engineers and build these virtual worlds, is to really study how the mind operates inside of virtual reality. We're going to tell you about how the technology works, where it's going in the future, and exactly what happens in the brain when you're having a virtual experience compared to when you're having a physical one.
Am I proud? This is a world full of real people. The environment of all those people that you see, there is a human being behind the graphical representation of them.
What exactly is true?
Some pretty big changes are inevitable.
uncharted waters, the deep mysteries that we don't have insight into yet.
So the history of that was we'd had some visitors over the years from Denmark, and they'd all gone back to Denmark. And so they all had an interest in sort of virtual worlds, coming at it from different perspectives. They're all from different disciplines. And so a group in Denmark, together with me at Stanford, we organized this workshop, and it took several weeks, or months even, to put it together. And the idea was to come at virtuality from all different perspectives, to really take it apart and try to understand what it is. Not to build a virtual world. I mean, that was sort of the end of it, possibly. But to just understand it from all perspectives. And it was kind of wild. We even got someone from the Theatre Studies department to come and do a workshop for actors, to learn what it's like to adopt a different personality, you know, to forget yourself, to learn how to just get into a different character. So the whole thing was deconstructing it and putting it together. In the same way we're doing it with education now. What is education? What's going on when you can bring in technologies and separate the different components of education? And H-Star is just one of many groups that does this kind of thing. But it is fundamental research. It's humanities research mostly into people, built around the idea that we've got the technologies at our fingertips and we've got access to them locally. So, but it's thousands of years old education brought back together. And one of the, having given a MOOC, and then we can just start chatting. I gave my first MOOC last September, Introduction to Mathematical Thinking, and there were not that many MOOCs back then, and I got 72,000 students, of whom about 12,000 took the final exam, which was kind of an amazing number. Gave it again, a revised version of it in the spring. It's running now. We've got about 2 more weeks to go. I don't know what time it is in California now, but I may be lecturing at this very moment. But I've got something like 27,000 students at the moment in this one. It's a smaller one, but I still expect we'll graduate about 1,000. But it's kind of interesting. Having gone through it twice, you do anything that's intense, and it takes over your life for several months. It's a huge operation. But the senses you come away are kind of important. I mean, they tell you a lot, just your human perception of what you've done. And my human perception from the first time and the second one, it wasn't the technology. I mean, that was just a pain in the neck. I actually had to learn to Python script to keep things running because the Coursera platform was still under development. So it was really kind of weird. I was entering release times in Unix timestamps and things. I had to learn tons of stuff I didn't know just to get the course going. So there was a bunch of technology that was involved, and things kept going wrong and had to be fixed. But that was just at the background. You know, Apple Maps came out at the same time, and that was a disaster. So, you know, even experienced companies can have technology problems. And American Airlines went down a couple of days ago for technology problems. But that wasn't the memory. I mean, that's just things that go wrong all the time. My memory is of a really intense human experience, because for 6 weeks, and the first time I gave the course was for 6 weeks, essentially, that was a truly global community. There was probably every nation represented except North Korea, online. Because I had deadlines, hundreds of thousands tens of thousands of people in my case, were online at roughly the same time, posting on the chat rooms, doing stuff from different parts of the world. And so you've got this group of people around the world coming together for a period of time with a shared goal, sort of comparative backgrounds in some ways, but coming from very different backgrounds in other ways, all about the same thing, and having to rely on each other. Because, you know, all I could do was prepare some lectures, answer a few questions online. I wouldn't answer individual emails. You know, the professor is just this sort of catalyst that makes it happen. Ultimately, an online course, at least a course like this is not instructional. This is learning how to think a certain way. I deliberately called it Introduction to Mathematical Thinking because it wasn't about how you learn mathematical techniques. You can do that on YouTube. Khan Academy teaches you how to do techniques. Not very well, but it does teach you how to do techniques. This was about learning how to solve problems that you've never seen before. How do you learn to think a different way? And I can't help them to do that online. I can do that with the graduate students, one-on-one. But online, they're going to have to learn from each other. So it's really about building a community and setting the situation up so that everybody helps each other and they all come together. With sort of Wikipedia-like elements, this is still under development, but it's really about building communities. It's about how do we build short-term, international, online communities that come together to achieve a shared goal and then move on their way. So it's more based on the idea of Facebook than YouTube. The videos are just punctuations. It's a way of, you need something for them all to talk about. So you give them a half-hour video lecture and you give them an assignment sheet. And from then on, it's up to them to work from each other. And the question is, how well can we use the technology to make that work? How good can we get it? How can we design the curriculum so that the linguistic problems are minimized? So that the different cultural problems are minimized? So that people can deal with different time shifts? It's an interesting challenge, how to do that. And this is what is going on at Stanford. People are asking these fundamental questions. How do you make that work? So that was my first experience, was it been part of this incredible, self-motivated, self-selected online community that was truly global. And that was really one hell of a feeling. I mean, this was a rush. There was no doubt about it. So that was sort of one of the big memories I had, was of being part of an incredible global community. The other experience I had, and that was a surprise to me. I didn't realize I'd get that big a rush from simply going online. And I did it last night. I was here, I'm still on California time, so when you were all asleep, I was online checking the forums and responding to some of the student questions. And that's a really interesting question. That's a really interesting experience. Wherever you are in the world, you can log on. I could log on now from a laptop and talk to people around the world about something that I'm passionate about, mathematics and mathematical thinking. The other experience is one I did expect, but it was much more palpable than I thought it was going to be. And this was a suspicion that, I actually don't like this kind of an audience, because not you guys, but I mean, it's the wrong size, right? I mean, there's too many of you to interact individually. It just doesn't work. And I really hate classes of 300 students. What I really like is a class of 5 or 6 students. Actually, ideally, I like working with a graduate student, one-on-one. That's really neat. Get to know them and work closely with them. 5 or 6 is okay in a seminar. I always used to cap my classes at 25, because I don't like more than 25. I like to get to know their names and things. And then beyond it, it's just theatre. This is theatre performance. You just have an audience and you just chat for a while. Okay, so, and you might think that the bigger an audience, I once gave a commencement address to I don't know about how many tens of thousands of people, and that was just weird. You've got this huge audience. It's just a sea out there. Well, okay, what's it like with 60,000 people all around the world? The answer is you're back to one-on-one. It's really interesting, because the only way I can think of to approach an online course is to think the way you do if you're on TV or radio. And anyone who does TV or radio knows that the trick is to think of one viewer or one listener and to talk to that person as you would if they were right next to you. You just chat, it's personal, and you just get to know them. And on an online course, that's what it's about. It's one-on-one teaching. It brings everybody next to the professor. If you watch my videos, most of the time, you just see my left hand on a piece of paper as if you're sitting next to me. I film all my lectures, overhead camera at a desk, so you get just the same experience as if you're sitting next to me. And so it brings you back to the original idea of the apprentice learning alongside the expert. And I think this is going to be powerful, because we're finding a way to scale globally one-on-one apprentice learning. We haven't figured out the direct feedback. There's too many. We have to crowdsource feedback. But the degree to which we can crowdsource feedback, it'll work. And I think we can be hopeful about crowdsourcing feedback because it worked for Wikipedia. Wikipedia works pretty darned well by crowdsourcing expertise. So I think we've got the ingredients for bringing back the apprentice system, which is the oldest form of learning that's been known and the most effective. And the technology just makes that happen. Okay, and we can just chat now. And, yeah.
sometimes it's a shame we don't have time for just talking for hours. I'm sure there are questions. I'm going to give you a choice because we've set a coffee break now for half an hour, but my suggestion is we take 10 minutes of that coffee break for an interaction with questions. I'm sure some of you have questions you would want to field. Keith, is it all right that we do that? Okay, I sense an agreement. And I don't know the names of everybody here, so I'm just going to point. You in the blue shirt in the back. You start.
I'm Henrik from Zoe, and it's funny that you were talking about feedback last time, because that's what we're researching and doing in our company with EEG and eye-tracking devices for the one-to-one feedback. My question is, how are Stanford working to bridge the gap, the tempo gap between startup and the university? Because our experience is that the university has a totally different sense of time than the entrepreneurs. For us, 1 week or 14 days is eternity. For the university, kind of different time.
Yeah, well, Stanford's kind of different because almost all the academics are entrepreneurs themselves, and in fact probably one of them's working for the company. The model is very common where the academic does the same, so it's kind of unusual. It is true that the university itself does have its own research, and research takes time and so forth. Stanford is absolutely not going to give up its position as a premier university, which means long-term fundamental research. You will not get tenure or promotion at Stanford if you're not producing in the leading journals. It's absolutely ruthless that way. And so it does mean that the people that survive are capable of doing that and juggling the other thing of the research. So Stanford is a very atypical case that shouldn't really be emulated because so many factors have come to make that happen. But the reality is you do get a lot of fast responses there. Everyone at Stanford has a 20% rule. We can all spend 20% of our time on Stanford's pay working on our own stuff. I mean, many Silicon Valleys have that as well, and in many cases it came from Stanford. That's something that Stanford's always had. If you have an idea for a startup company, you can easily take a leave of absence or reduce time. You know, our first app is coming out in the App Store within 3 or 4 weeks. We're then going to try and get a $2 million Series A funding round. If we get that, the funders will insist that I, at the very least, take reduced time, and so will Stanford. Stanford will say, you are now the CEO. Well, actually, I'm not the CEO. I gave that one up, but I will be the president and the chief ideas guy. Stanford is going to say, quite rightly, that's a responsibility now. This is no longer just that you're going to have to take reduced time because they will not allow you to develop a company on their money. So there are strict rules about that. But it will be easy to make that arrangement. And so people move in and out all the time. So there's a constant flow of people up and down University Avenue, essentially, between the university and Silicon Valley with the ideas. But it is the fact that there's so much integration between Stanford and the startup companies that people are wandering around all the time. There are just people with startup companies coming in all the time. Stanford, since there's a lot of interest now in these online learning platforms, and since I gave my MOOC, I've been approached by large corporations and small startups interested in creating platforms and various supplies. I mean, there's a whole ecosystem building very, very fast to support these, what they think will be distributed global universities.
Can we allow a couple of more?
Yeah, okay.
There were a couple more hands that I would just like to include a few more if we have them. I think over here was first.
Yeah.
Thanks. How would you define the good future university?
It's not my job to define it. It's up to the society to decide what the university is. I mean, to a large extent, because we're talking about broadcasting something for the world, I think the population is going to decide it with their feet or their fingers or the URLs they enter. So I think it's a mistake to define it in terms of what we have now. You know, I mean, there's all of this talk about attrition rates. What a spurious metric. I mean, who cares how many people that sign up don't graduate? I mean, it's a different model. We are doing a ton of research into these. As all of this, practically everyone in the Graduate School of Education is doing research into these courses. That's why they're becoming TAs. So we are learning a lot about why people do online learning, what their interests are, what they want to do, what they find difficult. And so we're collecting a ton of data as to what motivates people. And it's not the same. These are not, well, in some cases they're people who would have liked a traditional education but are in a part of the world or have economic circumstances that prevent them. There are people who are coming into the MOOCs to get an education of a traditional kind that they wouldn't otherwise have. They're typically the ones who start at day one, do all the exercises, take the exam, and worry about getting a good exam result. In my class, out of the 72,000 or so, there were about 1,200 that fitted that. Most of them weren't ever going to do that. They were doing other things, and we're only beginning to find out why they're doing what they're doing. And I think once you take apart all the parts of a university, I think what's going to happen is we're going to end up with a smorgasbord, I'm in the right country to use that word, a smorgasbord of different offerings, and people will put together their own education, and organizations will give them accreditation. And some of the startup companies that are coming up in Silicon Valley and around the world that I'm hearing from are trying to put together mechanisms whereby people can assemble an education out of a distributed network of different offerings. And I think that's what's going to happen.
One more question. You.
All right. I'm Pauline Voss. I'm a professor of mathematics education here locally. And my question to you, Keith, is do you think that the MOOCs are more suitable for some subjects, like your subject, mathematics, and for other subjects, like psychology or history?
Subjects that involve equipment-heavy laboratories are clearly going to be challenges. You'd need a local facility to do that. But there are local facilities. I don't think... I think MOOCs will probably drive some institutions out of business. But I think what's really going to happen is they'll reconfigure what they're doing and become part of this ecosystem. If you take the MOOCs and the various things to do with MOOCs and you sort of drop them in and let the ripples settle, then people will start to assemble things. If it's a discipline like biology or physics or something where you need laboratories, people may take their lectures from some famous MIT person and then go to a local facility. If it's disciplines like creative writing and so forth, you'll need another network of help because you really do need all sorts of much more personal attention. If you're doing creative writing, you really need to talk one-on-one with an expert in that to really do it. Doing it distributed. But I think that will all be filled in the way that Wikipedia works, you get this whole group. In the case of mathematics, there's a lot of qualitative feedback that you need for mathematical reasoning, but there's also an issue of correctness. And so what I'm trying to do is actively trying to build a sort of a Wikipedia-like community of volunteers who come in and do this. And when there's enough of them, we'll be able to give them credit for their institution to submit with their tenure record. I think within 5 years, people who are TAs in my course and other mathematics MOOCs, I'll be writing letters when they go up for tenure at their own institution, and they'll be valuable. That's already happening with Wikipedia. People use Wikipedia contributions with their tenure applications, some successfully. I think the system will have to adapt, but you've got to look at the whole system. And when the ripples have settled, I think that they'll all have solutions. I don't think MOOCs are a temporary thing, but I think they've got to settle in the system, and we'll just see how it settles down.
Thank you so much, Keith. I think you've given us a very important lecture for one thing, when you're raising questions that are of very profound relevance for our institution and for the Nordic countries. I'm sure there will be more times and chances to interact, but we have a long day ahead of us, so we do need some breaks. I'm going to ask you to be back